On May 25th, 2006, Lincoln Hall, Thomas Weber, and a few other climbers in their group reached the summit of Mount Everest. For a few brief moments, they were literally on top of the world, and yet just a few hours later, they found themselves absolutely, excuse my language, on the way back down from the summit. Weber suddenly collapsed and he died on the spot. And shortly after this, Lincoln Hall found himself heading for the same fate. He too fell to the ground with the other members of his expedition pleading for him to get back to his feet. Everybody knew that if Hall couldn't get moving again, they would have no choice but to leave him for dead and continue down the mountain before they too became victims of Mount Everest. In a desperate final attempt to revive him, Hall's climbing partners poked him directly in the eyeball, hoping to get any response from him. This yielded nothing, and thus Lincoln Hall was left for dead. The news of his death quickly spread, and because of this, the next day, a group of climbers that were making their way up the mountain were fully aware that they would likely be stepping over the dead body of Lincoln Hall at some point on their climb. When they were only 2 hours shy of the summit, they noticed a frozen man sitting up in the middle of a knife-edge ridge, and when they approached him, this man introduced himself as Lincoln Hall. He was somehow still alive, but all the climbers knew that this wouldn't be the case for much longer unless something drastic happened. There's no ambulances or air rescues up in the death zone on Mount Everest, so these men knew that the only way Hall would survive is if they took immediate action to get him down the mountain. They also knew that this would make it impossible for them to summit Mount Everest, something that they had spent months and months training for and spent more than $20,000 each in order to achieve. These men had accidentally stumbled into a disturbing moral dilemma. Do they continue on and achieve their lifelong dream of summiting the highest mountain in the world, or do they abandon that dream just to give a complete stranger on the verge of death a slightly better chance of survival? As other groups of climbers passed by, keeping their distance because they didn't want to get involved, the men who had come to the aid of the dying Lincoln Hall made their decision. This is the harrowing story of Lincoln Hall. Many people simply can't fathom why the hell anyone would climb Mount Everest. Now, don't get me wrong, I think it would be super cool to reach the highest point in the entire world. Like, I get that, but obviously attempting to achieve this goal comes with tremendous risk. Many climbers have died on Mount Everest, and as much as I hate to say it, many more will die in the years to come. In 2006, Lincoln Hall would have definitely been aware of this risk when he set out on his second ever attempt to reach the summit. Lincoln Hall was from Canberra, Australia. And by the way, to my Australian listeners, let me know if I said that right, Canberra. And by the time that he was 15 years old, he was already on a path to eventually reach the highest point in the world. In 1970, one of his physical education teachers actually took him to Namadgi National Park in the southeastern part of the country on what would be the very first climbing trip of the young Hall's life. Apparently this teacher was like a well-known local climber, and so Hall was, at least in theory, in good hands. However, Mother Nature must have wanted to challenge the pair that day for whatever reason, because the end of their climb was just straight up dangerous. It was raining significantly that afternoon, and the rocks were just extremely slippery, so slippery that Hall eventually had to stop climbing himself, and they just pulled him up by the rope. He apparently, and unsurprisingly, did not have a very good time on this first climbing trip, and this might not sound like it would be the start of a climbing career that would eventually lead him to Mount Everest, but despite his initial miserable and straight up dangerous experience, Mount Everest is eventually where Hall would end up. Now, before we get any further, and especially before we get into the very disturbing parts of this story, I do just want to keep things fun for a moment longer and tell you about Drink Element. Drink Element is the sponsor of this video. They're also the longest running sponsor I've ever had on my channel, and they are the #1 electrolyte drink mix that you need to check out if you haven't already. See guys, the thing is, if you're going to be doing anything that causes you to sweat a lot, I mean, certainly something like hiking, which I know a lot of you do, but it could be any athletic, anything at all. It could just be shoveling your driveway or whatever. If you're sweating, you need to be replacing your electrolytes. If you don't do this, you're gonna get muscle cramps, you're gonna feel fatigued. It's just so important, and it's important that you do it with an electrolyte drink mix that isn't full of like sugar and other crap like that. That's where Drink Element comes in. It doesn't have any of that stuff. All it has is the electrolytes that you need and a great taste. If you watch my channel a lot, you've heard me talk about this before. Drink Element has the best flavors. I love grapefruit salt. I love citrus salt. Orange salt is kind of a sleeper pick as well. And they also have these more like unique and creative, thinking outside the box kind of flavors like mango chili, chocolate salt, even an unflavored version. Nobody else in the electrolyte drink mix game is doing this stuff. You really want to try all their flavors, and there's a way that you can do that. Go to drinkelement.com/KyleHatesHiking. That's drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking. Go make a purchase of whichever flavor sounds best to you. And when you do that through my link, you're actually going to get a sample pack of 8 additional flavors thrown in with your order for no extra cost, so you can try all these awesome flavors. You really want to do that, trust me. drinklmnt.com/KyleHatesHiking, or click the link in the description. Supporting our sponsors is one of the best ways to support this content, and so go check them out. And with that said, let's get back to the story. So, despite the fact that his very first climbing trip definitely did not go according to plan, which is kind of an understatement, Lincoln Hall would go on to climb again and again and again, and by the time that he entered university, he was regarded as one of the best climbers in the Canberra area. Still not sure if I'm saying that name right, by the way. I'm sorry, Australians, if I got it wrong. Hall studied at the Australian National University, where he became known for climbing on the walls of the buildings around campus, which is pretty epic. Word about his skills quickly spread throughout the university, and before he knew it, he actually found himself with like impromptu live audiences when he would do these climbs. This just happened on accident and just because he was so impressive. That was never his intention. All he wanted to do was to practice, because Lincoln Hall had his mind set on much more ambitious routes, we'll say, than just the walls of the ANU library. Eventually, Hall made the transition from a climber into a proper mountaineer. In 1978, he traveled to the Himalayas as part of his very first expedition ever, and boy, would it be an eventful one. Now, this expedition's goal was to reach the summit of a mountain called Dunagiri. Again, I could be pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry. And this mountain stands just over 23,000 feet in elevation, or around 7,000 meters. Due to some very bad weather, the summit attempt was eventually called off. The expedition basically decided to just give it up. But Lincoln Hall and one of his fellow classmates named Tim McCartney Snape were actually assigned to climb up the route in order to like gather the ropes and the equipment that had been placed by the expedition. And while they were in the process of doing this, the two men ended up making a very bold, some would even say dangerous decision when they found themselves in an unanticipated window of good weather. The two men made an on-the-spot decision to push for the summit, and McCartney Snape would actually end up making it to the top, but unfortunately Lincoln Hall wouldn't. Not only did he not make it to the top, he almost wound up dead. Hall became severely frostbitten, and by the time that he made it back down to base camp, he was in such a bad condition that he actually had to be airlifted to the nearest hospital. Like, he couldn't even walk out himself. Thankfully, he did end up surviving somehow, although he lost a few toes in the process. Remember, this is his very first expedition. Now, I'm willing to bet that for most people, or for myself anyways, I'll speak for myself, a brush with death like this on your very first time trying something would probably mean that you wouldn't do it again, ever. That was definitively not the case for Lincoln Hall. In fact, literally the exact freaking opposite thing happened. Lincoln Hall was just getting started, and after a few more expeditions on various Himalayan peaks, Lincoln Hall was set to make his very first attempt at climbing Mount Everest. In 1984, Lincoln Hall, McCartney Snape, and a few other experienced climbers made an attempt at becoming the first Australians to ever reach the summit of Mount Everest. And as if this wasn't already daunting enough, they planned to attempt the mountain via a brand new route on the north face that had never been climbed before. And in addition to that, they planned to make the attempt without the use of supplemental oxygen. In case you weren't aware, that's a big deal. Now, I'm a backpacker, I'm not a mountaineer, so I've never had to use supplemental oxygen, and I'm far from an expert on it. But my understanding is that once you get above, say, like 26,000 feet or around 8,000 meters in elevation, oxygen levels are just so thin. They're like less than half of what they are at sea level, and because of this, it just becomes very difficult to breathe and just to survive, for that matter. I mean, you're on borrowed time at that elevation. The team spent months preparing for the summit push, preparing both logistically and physically. While digging a snow cave at around 22,000 feet, which I guess was to be used as a future campsite on their actual summit push, Lincoln Hall would experience yet another brush with death when an unexpected avalanche nearly buried him alive. This experience was actually so traumatic that one of his fellow climbers, an extremely experienced and accomplished mountaineer, by the way, decided that he no longer wanted to make an attempt at summiting the mountain. However, Lincoln Hall, McCartney Snape, and a few others on their team were still determined to make it all the way to the top, and so they continued to acclimate, fix ropes, and set up campsites along their planned route. Eventually, Hall and McCartney Snape actually dodged a severe winter storm, descending back down to advanced base camp just before the storm hit. And though they missed like the worst of the storm and they were fine, the storm still left an impact on the expedition and particularly on Lincoln Hall. After this storm, Hall developed a chest infection, and this left him just hacking and wheezing and just severely weakened. He would go on to slowly recover from this infection, but he was never able to fully regain his strength. Eventually, that expedition member that had temporarily dropped out rejoined the push for the summit, and actually on October 3rd, 1984, Hall, McCartney Snape, and 3 other climbers made their push for the summit of Mount Everest. Hall made it past 26,000 feet, or again, roughly 8,000 meters, but he eventually had to make the very wise decision to turn around. Just like had happened on his very first expedition, he was once again suffering from frostbite, and he understandably did not want to lose any more toes or lose any more fingers or anything like that. McCartney Snape and a climber named Greg Mortimer ended up successfully summiting Mount Everest before turning around and meeting Hall back at their highest camp. Even though Hall had turned around shy of the summit, his presence was still like completely indispensable as the climbers spent the next couple days descending back down the mountain. Greg Mortimer had actually started to deteriorate physically, and without the help of Lincoln Hall, he likely would have died on his way down the mountain. So this expedition was a massive deal in Australia. I mean, they had made history. They were the first ones from the country to ever summit, and their expedition would actually go on to be written about in articles and books and discussed in movies and documentaries for years afterwards, even to this day. And even though he hadn't made it to the summit, Lincoln Hall was a part of that expedition, and so he had essentially cemented his place in Australian climbing history. He would go on to summit a few more peaks, including the 5th highest in the world, and he would also become an author. He would publish multiple books about Mount Everest and about various mountaineers who had tackled it. He settled into a prospering career, and he also started a family, and yet despite this comfortable place in his life, he couldn't quite shake his desire to reach the summit of Mount Everest and to reach the tallest spot in the entire world. Now, the reason that I've told you Lincoln Hall's background in such extensive detail is because, well, I mean, it's fascinating, first of all, but more importantly, because I just want to illustrate to you how many times he found himself in dangerous situations while he was mountaineering. I don't think this viewpoint's necessarily common, but I have seen it before. I think that some people who aren't into mountaineering, who aren't mountaineers, can sometimes assume that people who run into trouble on Mount Everest are just like naive to the risks. And I'm just going to tell you, this is not true the vast majority of the time. After surviving multiple near-death experiences in the mountains, any future Everest attempts that Lincoln Hall made would come with a full understanding of all of the risks involved, obviously. And just in case he forgot about these risks for some reason, all Lincoln Hall would have had to do is simply look down at his bare feet. In 2006, Lincoln Hall was given another chance to summit Mount Everest. He was now 50 years old, and despite his extensive mountaineering experience, his age would obviously raise the risk factor at least a little bit on a feat that was already just so incredibly risky. But then again, plenty of other climbers his age and much older had successfully summited Mount Everest. So it's not like it was unheard of for someone who was 50 to do it either. And so he arrived at Everest Base Camp in April of 2006, and he was going to be accompanied on this expedition by a man named Richard Harris and Harris's 15-year-old son, Chris. Now, this is significant because Chris was actually attempting to become the youngest person to ever reach the top of Mount Everest at the time, and Hall, one of the most famous mountaineers in Australia, was invited on the expedition to help oversee this history-making accomplishment. Now, that's not to say that he was the leader of the expedition. He wasn't, but his experience and his expertise would be completely indispensable for a successful and safe summit attempt. The team spent the rest of April and most of May training and acclimating, and in the process of doing this, they would have heard about the disturbing and controversial story of British climber David Sharp. Sharp became incapacitated while he was high up on Everest on May 15th, 2006, and despite being passed by over 40 different climbers, he was ultimately left to die. Or at least that's what the headlines were saying at the time. I actually did a full video on the controversial death of David Sharp. I'll have a link above, or is it here, one of these places, and also in the description in case you haven't seen that video. The death of David Sharp had ignited the already fiery debate about what obligation climbers had to assist other climbers, especially when it meant putting themselves at heightened risk in the process. Just days after David Sharp had died, and while this debate was still raging, Lincoln Hall and the rest of his expedition began their final push for the summit of Mount Everest. Along with the Harrises, Hall's team also included 5 Sherpas, a Dutch guide, and interestingly enough, a visually impaired German climber named Thomas Weber. Weber also had a photographer climbing with him as well. Things didn't start off very strong for this expedition. They quickly began losing members when Richard Harris came down with an intense cough. I mean, this was a bad cough. It got so bad that he actually couldn't eat. I mean, imagine that. That's brutal. If you can't eat, you obviously won't have enough energy to climb. It would just be dangerous. And so this forced Harris to turn around and head back down to base camp. The rest of the team pushed on, however, but unfortunately, Harris's son Chris was the next one to drop out. Now, Chris did make it further up than his father, but he too would eventually fall ill. He was having trouble breathing, and ultimately he was told that he needed to turn around and head back down to base camp. The air was just too thin for him. He just wasn't adjusting to the altitude up there. And so Hall, Weber, and the rest of the team continued on until May 25th, when they made their final push for the summit of Mount Everest. It was now 22 years after his first attempt. I mean, Lincoln Hall was about to go for Everest attempt number 2 at age 50. Hall had promised his wife and his 2 sons that he would make it back from Everest alive. His family was definitely nervous about him throwing himself back into the world of mountaineering, but at the same time, they also recognized just how much it meant to him, and given his incredible skill set, they were ultimately supportive of him attempting to achieve this lifelong dream. In reference to her final conversation with Hall before his departure, his wife said, quote, "I think we just all said that we wanted to see him again. And, please keep that in mind and not to take any risks, it wasn't worth it." Lincoln Hall and his Sherpas summited Mount Everest at 9 a.m. local time on May 25th, 2006. It's actually been reported that Hall was the first person to reach the summit that day, and so for a brief moment, he was undisputedly the highest person in the entire world, which is just incredible. And it's also incredible that at 50 years old, he had succeeded in achieving the very same dream that he had failed back at age 28. While standing on top of Mount Everest was quite literally a high point of Lincoln Hall's life, the descent back down would end up being every climber's worst nightmare. And this nightmare started literally only minutes after they began climbing back down from the summit. Thomas Weber, the visually impaired member of the expedition, couldn't keep up towards the top of the mountain and actually ended up turning around with his guide before they reached the summit. His condition then began to deteriorate before, this is super disturbing, he just suddenly proclaimed, quote, "I'm dying," and then he just collapsed into the snow. He then began sliding downwards through the snow for a little bit before a few climbers were actually able to catch up with him and to check on him. One of these climbers was quoted saying, "I looked for signs of life like a pulse, breath, reaction to pupils, but could only determine that Thomas had gone, i.e. died, likely from the moment he collapsed, by then maybe 10 or 15 minutes ago." So tragically, the expedition loses Thomas Weber, and things only got worse for the expedition after this. The next climber who began to deteriorate was Lincoln Hall himself. As his team was traversing down the 3rd and the 2nd steps, Hall became more and more delirious. He basically began hallucinating, and he was like slurring his speech. And the Sherpas that were with him, that were helping him down, soon realized that he was suffering from altitude sickness. They continued to help him for a while, but eventually he just laid down and he refused to get up. The Sherpas, they tried to help him. I mean, they made an incredible effort. They gave him oxygen. They attempted to coax him back to his feet, and they stayed there trying to help him for hours and hours and hours. I'm talking 9 hours. That's how much time passed, and the whole time they were trying to help him. And the entire time, their own conditions were starting to deteriorate as well. After being stranded in the same spot at such high elevation for so long, they were starting to run extremely low on bottled oxygen, and it was also later in the day now, and it was starting to get dark. This entire time, Lincoln Hall made no improvements, quite the opposite, actually. And so by 7 p.m., the Sherpas basically concluded that he was dead. He was gone. But in a last-ditch effort to assess his condition, the Sherpas actually pulled open one of his eyelids and they just poked him directly in the eyeball. The reason that they did this is because, surely if there was any life left in him, he would have responded to this, at least in some way, and they could have been able to tell that he was alive, but unfortunately, they poked him directly in the eyeball and he still didn't respond. And so with that, in order to save their own lives, the Sherpas had no choice but to just leave Hall at this point and descend down the mountain before they too ended up in the same dire position. They made such a strong effort to save him, but eventually their expedition leaders ordered them to leave over the radio. And so at that point, Lincoln Hall was essentially left for dead. And it didn't take long for the news media to pick up on the story of what had happened, especially since they were already on heightened alert for Everest stories after what had happened to David Sharp only like 10 days prior. And of course, if the news media had already started writing about Lincoln Hall's death, that also meant that his family soon found out as well. I mean, this is just brutal stuff. Like, talk about the worst phone call you could ever receive. I guess only minutes after the Sherpas left Hall, his wife received the phone call that, I mean, every single climber's spouse would fear. She was contacted by one of Hall's friends, and she was quoted saying his voice, referring to the caller, was broken up. He said, "I don't know how to tell you," and I said, "Well, you don't have to." I think the worst part of what he told me was that Lincoln had only passed away 20 minutes earlier. You know, while I'd been sitting there waiting, my husband had been dying. Talk about an absolute freaking punch to the gut, dude. So Hall's wife and his 2 sons then spent the next few hours sobbing, trying to come to terms with the major loss that their family had just taken. I mean, as far as they knew, Lincoln Hall had become yet another frozen body on the side of Mount Everest, and he would likely stay there for a long, long time, perhaps forever. As they began to face this cruel reality and as they began to grieve, they would have had no way of knowing that Lincoln Hall was not actually dead. He probably should have been at this point, but Lincoln Hall had made a promise to his family before he left for Everest. He promised that he would return alive, and now as he sat all alone high up on Mount Everest in the pitch dark, he was fighting off death in order to keep this promise. Hall's hallucinations were just fierce. He was imagining conversations. He was imagining that he was in like a completely different place, like in a boat or something like that. He imagined that he was surrounded by various people that he knew. But after existing in this state for hours and hours and hours, all of a sudden he just snapped back into reality. Okay, maybe not like full reality, but by some miracle, Lincoln Hall was all of a sudden able to assess where he was and assess the state that he was in. This was a crucial step in the right direction, but he was still unable to like do simple things like move his feet, let alone stand up. And so he realized that his only hope was if somebody came across him the next day. He used what remained of his strength to kind of sit up and then cross his legs, and he did this in an effort to conserve his body heat. And then he waited and waited and waited. Because the news of Hall and Weber's presumed deaths traveled so quickly, teams that were poised to climb the mountain on the morning of May 26th learned that they would likely be encountering the men's dead bodies as they made their push for the summit. And so, with this in mind, that very same morning, a team consisting of 4 climbers, Dan Mazur, Miles Osborne, Andrew Brash, and Jangbu Sherpa, well, these men made their way towards the summit of Mount Everest, the highest point in the world. And when they reached the top of an obstacle known as the first step, what they found absolutely shocked them. Dan Mazur was quoted saying, "I saw in the distance a little bit of yellow fabric on the ridgetop, and I thought, what is that? A tent or something? And then I got a little closer and I could see that it was a person." So at the first step, this group of climbers found a man in very bad shape, but still alive, sitting up, legs crossed. And when they got up to him, this man reportedly said to the group, quote, "I imagine you're surprised to see me here." Shockingly, he then told them that his name was Lincoln Hall. Mazur said, quote, "I have never seen anything like that before. The thing that struck me was how he was holding his hands up and he had no gloves on. You could see his fingers had frozen and they were sort of a waxy yellow. And then below that, it looked like normal skin, and he was holding up his hands like this and sort of looking around. I was blown away." Mazur actually took some photos of Hall at this point, and here are what I'm pretty sure are those photos. To correct a mistake I actually made in the David Sharp video, I thought that this photo was of David Sharp. They do look pretty similar, to be fair, but that was a mistake on my part, and a few people pointed that out to me in the comments, which I'm very grateful for, by the way. I always try to bring you the most accurate information in these videos, and of course, I do make mistakes sometimes, so always open to hearing about that. But anyways, Mazur and his team quickly got to work saving Hall's life. They helped him get his gloves back on. They gave him some food and some water. And they also critically prevented the still hallucinating Hall from accidentally rolling off the steep cliffs that were on either side of them. They also radioed out that Hall was still alive and that he needed rescue, which of course sent shockwaves through Everest Base Camp. And while all of this was happening, apparently at least 2 unnamed climbers passed by the group, and these climbers opted to just continue their journey to the summit rather than stopping to help the rescue attempt. Mazur, Osborne, Brash, and the Sherpa could have made that same decision, by the way. Mazur was the guide, and both Osborne and Brash had paid over $20,000 each for this expedition, $20,000 each in order to reach the summit of Mount Everest. That's what they were there to do. That's what they were paying this incredible amount of money to do. And it's not like they were, at the bottom of the mountain still. At this point, they were literally only a few hours, 2 hours away from the summit, and everyone in their group was healthy. Everything was going well. I mean, they definitely were on track to make it. The men knew that if they waited with Lincoln Hall any longer, that they would run out of time to reach the summit. But they also knew that if they did continue on to the summit, Hall would almost certainly die. And thus, the men had a choice to make. Do they give up on their dream of summiting Mount Everest while they were so close to the top in order to save the life of a complete stranger? Or do they get their money's worth, go tag the summit and likely leave this man to die? Mazur, Osborne, Brash, and the Sherpa made the selfless decision to wait with Lincoln Hall, keeping him alive until the rescue party showed up. Incredibly, this took 4 hours. After this, Hall was assisted by a heroic group of Sherpas down the mountain. Apparently, he was still hallucinating and he was fighting with them, and it was kind of a struggle. I guess it was obviously it was a total ordeal. It took a few days, but eventually he was finally able to be evacuated out of the backcountry and receive proper medical attention. And also in the middle of this rescue, once he kind of came to a little bit more, he was actually able to call his wife, who I imagine was beyond thrilled and probably extremely surprised to hear his voice. I mean, can you imagine that phone call after your husband's been basically declared dead and then all of a sudden he calls you? Man. So the group of men that day saved Hall's life. I mean, there's no question about it. And when asked about this, Lincoln Hall said, quote, "Chances are that had they not been there, I would have died. But people who are sort of committed mountaineers, those people know that the summit isn't the most important thing, and getting down alive is the most important thing. And that includes getting other people down alive as well." Lincoln Hall would end up losing one of his big toes to frostbite, as well as the majority of his fingertips. He also suffered a paralyzed vocal cord, which fortunately actually returned to normal function after a few months. He would go on to write and speak extensively about his Everest experience, and he also maintained a close friendship with the men who saved his life on the mountain that day. Tragically, in March of 2012, Lincoln Hall passed away after suffering from mesothelioma. He was only 56 years old at the time, so it's super sad, but he did leave behind a stunning legacy that I think we can all learn from and be inspired by. Let me know what you think of his story and what you think of the men who gave up their summit attempt after paying so much money and going through so much just to save him. And also let me know how you think I did covering this story. I'm really fascinated by Mount Everest, and I'd like to get better at telling these stories as I do them more often, and so I'm always open to constructive feedback. And so if you watched this far into the video, I'd really appreciate it if you'd hit that subscribe button and help us reach our goal of 1 million subscribers on this channel. We've got a long way to go, and subscribing, commenting, and sharing this video with your friends all those are the best way to support this content, and they're all completely free. But much more importantly than that, may Lincoln Hall rest in peace, and my heart goes out to his friends and his family. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next week.